Okay, so for the second part of my 2017 wrap-up, I thought that I would share my Goodreads Year in Books page, as that's the easiest way for me to show you the covers and some of the details about all the books I read last year. Um, I'll also link it down below if any of you are interested in taking a look at the page, if you're curious about anything or if you want to check out any of the books that are mentioned. So as I mentioned earlier, I read 50 books in 2017, and that totaled to 14,597 pages. The shortest book I read was 111 pages, and that was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. And the longest book that I read was Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, which was 884 pages. So the average length of books that I read in 2017 was 292 pages. The most popular book that I read was Animal Farm by George Orwell, and about 2.7 million other people have also read that book. And then the least popular book that I read was Victorine by Catherine Texier, which only 218 other people have read. And Victorine is a book that is, it shifts between turn-of-the-century France and colonial Vietnam, and it follows, it's loosely based on a true story of the author's great-grandmother, who decides to follow her lover to Vietnam and leave her husband and children behind in France. And then you learn about her story and watch as she struggles between deciding to stay in Vietnam or returning to her family in France. So the average rating that I gave books for 2017 was 3.8 stars out of 5. And the book that I read that was the highest rated on Goodreads was March Book 3, which has a 4.7 average, which surprised me a little because I found the first book in the series much better than the second two, so I'm surprised that it's Book 3 that is the highest rated. My first review of the year was for Africa, Altered States, Ordinary Miracles by Richard Dowden, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 star rating. And the review that I wrote says, overall this was a very engaging read and contained many interesting anecdotes of the author's time as a journalist across Africa. At times, however, it did begin to drag on a little, and he fell into some of the same tropes that he set out to avoid perpetuating. And then it lists all my books and shows the covers, which is good because if I wanted to do a wrap-up video showing physical copies, I'd have hardly any of these books because I mostly read books online or from the library or via ebooks or audiobooks. So I don't actually have physical copies of most of the books that I read in 2017, so having it here on Goodreads is super convenient for me. So I'll just go through them all and describe a couple of them to you. So the first book that I read was The Return of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And then I read Africa, Altered States, Ordinary Miracles by Richard Dowden. The Rabbi's Cat by Johann Sfar, and The Rabbi's Cat 2 by Johann Sfar. And these are actually really interesting graphic novels, again describing life for the author's ancestors, roughly turn-of-the-century Jewish family living in Algeria. So it's a really interesting take on Algeria. I don't know much about Algeria, but I knew absolutely nothing about the Jewish community there. So this was a really interesting and entertaining graphic novel series. I especially loved the first book, and I would highly recommend checking out the first book in the series. Then I read Laughing All the Way to the Mosque by Zarqua Nawaz. If anyone else is Canadian here, they might remember watching Little Mosque on the Prairie when they were growing up, and Zarqua Nawaz is the creator of Little Mosque on the Prairie, and this book details her childhood as well as her young adulthood, and then deciding to produce Little Mosque on the Prairie. I Am the Beggar of the World, Landlays from Contemporary Afghanistan. And landlays are a traditional form of poetry for females in Afghanistan, and this collects them and translates them into a poetry collection. Conclave by Robert Harris, Fun Home, a family tragicomic by Alison Bechdel, March Book 1 by John Lewis, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Victorine by Catherine Texier, Homegoing by Yag Gassi, Anne of Windy Poplars by Ella Montgomery, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Anne's House of Dreams by Ella Montgomery, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Dewar, Angels and Saints by Scott Hahn, The Joy of the Gospel by Pope Francis, Leaving Time by Jodi Picoult, Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, Hark, a Vagrant by Kate Beaton, The Novice by Thich Nhat Hanh, March Book 2 by John Lewis, Animal Farm by George Orwell, An Age of License by Lucy Neasley, Primates by Jim Ottaviani, Aya by Marguerite About, Anne of Ingleside by Ella Montgomery, American-Born Chinese by Jean Yang, March Book 3 by John Lewis, Rainbow Valley by Ella Montgomery, and Rilla of Ingleside by Ella Montgomery. And I was super happy last year to finally finish the Anne of Green Gables series by Ella Montgomery. I'd read the first 2 books many times when I was young, but I'd never read the whole series because I guess as Anne got older, I found it harder to relate to the books about her being in college and getting married and having children, and I was still 12. So I finally set a goal for myself to actually read all the way through the end of the series, because there's 8 books actually, and I really enjoyed it. And Rilla of Ingleside, well, you saw that it was one of my top reads of 2017. Then I read The Warden by Anthony Trollope, Emma by Jane Austen, and Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, Espresso Tales by Alexander Michael Smith, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, Small Great Things by Jodi Picoult, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, Home from the Vinyl Cafe by Stuart McLean, Miss Marchbanks by Margaret Oliphant, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, The Headmaster's Wager by Vincent Lamb, Relish, My Life in the Kitchen by Lucy Neasley, The Anatomy Lesson by Nina Segal, and that's an excellent book set in the Dutch Golden Age that when I do my video on Dutch Golden Age recommendations, I'll talk about more in depth. But it's based on the painting The Anatomy Lesson by Rembrandt, and it's actually all set during one day, the day of the painting, or the day of the sitting for that painting, and it's just excellent. Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, and Gold of Our Fathers by Quay Carty. And my last review of the year was for Anthony Trollope's The Warden, which I gave a 3 out of 5 stars. And I said that it was enjoyable, but after reading Dickens, it was a little strange to have such a straightforward plot. So I'm not the best about actually writing physical reviews. I give every book that I read a star rating, but I have a harder time coming up with reviews to write, and I want to get better at that. Better at that next year. So then in total, you can see that I read 50 books out of a goal of 24 books. So I accomplished my goal by 208%, which was excellent. And that's the details for my year in books from Goodreads. So the next part of my 2017 wrap-up and stats video is the stats portion. And for that, I'm drawing on this 2017 book survey spreadsheet that I have in Google Docs. And I downloaded this spreadsheet from Portal in the Pages. Of the year, she posted a video describing the spreadsheet style that she uses, and she offered it as a download. And it's worked really well for me in recording my reading in 2017. So a big shout out to her, and thank you for giving us a download of the spreadsheet. And I'm pretty sure I saw that she did a 2018 version of that video and included a download link for the 2018 version of this spreadsheet, which I will definitely be downloading and making use of, and I highly recommend that you check her channel out and take a look at that spreadsheet video. Anyway, so you can see this is where I enter all the information. So there's a place to put the title of the book, the author of the book, the genre, the page number, the age group that it's for, the star rating I give it at the end of reading it, and then the date started and finished. Then there's some publishing information about the publishing house and the date of publication. Some information about the author, their gender, the country they're from, the continent they're from, their race, and whether or not they wrote in their native language and the book is in translation. And then a couple questions about the type of book that it is, the format, whether it's online, Kindle, print, audiobook, etc. And then whether I own it or not, and whether it's a library book or not. So as I read in 2017, I just entered all the information into here. And I used Goodreads to help me update when I didn't know things like the page number or the publishing house because I read it online. And it was sometimes I fell behind updating this, and then I used Goodreads to fill in 4 or 5 at once. And then there's a summary tab that she has all set up to populate automatically, which shows the total books, which is 50, that I read 40 books if you don't count graphic novels. The page and average pages per book is similar to what I just showed you on my Goodreads page. Then there's some neat statistics, which I'm going to show in a visual form when we go to the charts tab. But it's the bottom here is kind of interesting. So I averaged 4 books per month, 1,200 pages per month, and 7 days per book in 2017. So I'll show the rest of the information from the summary tab in the chart format because it's easier to visualize. You can see that I started the year off really strong. I read 8 books per month for the first 3 months, and then I had kind of a dive in reading here. I find I never read as much in the summer because it's just nice weather. I want to be outside. I was doing some more traveling for work, so I didn't read very much at all in the summer months. And then October, I was participating in Victober, and I had a really good reading month there, and then it kind of dwindled off again as I was doing more traveling. And then this is the pages per month graph. So it's kind of interesting to see that even though I read the same amount of books in January, February, March, the number of pages that I read was actually quite different. But otherwise it's roughly the same distribution here. This graph shows that I read primarily adult fiction, 94% adult fiction, and 6% YA. And then this chart shows the different genres. Classics was my main genre that I read, which is 36% of my reading. Just general fiction was another 20%. Graphic novels were 20%. Historical fiction was 6%. Memoir was 2%. Nonfiction was 4%. Poetry was 4%. Religious was 4%. And short stories were 4%. Then this shows the distribution of star ratings. So I had, I guess, 5 2-star books, which sounds higher than I would have thought. 5 2-star books, 12 3-star books, 18 4-star books, and 15 5-star books. So maybe I'm a little generous on my star rating, but usually if I don't think it's a book I'm going to enjoy, I don't read it, so I kind of skew towards 4 and 5-star books. This shows the page length. So there's the one outlier here, which is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. It's pulling my average up a bit for me, the 800 to 899 category. But you can see that mostly I read books that were 200 to 299 pages. I didn't read anything under 100 pages. And then I read a few chunkier ones. There's 5 that were between 500 and 599. 5 that were between 400 and 499. 8 between 300 and 399. And then 14 between 100 and 199. And those would be primarily the graphic novels that I read. Author gender, I was exactly 50-50 split, which I was excited about because I wasn't really monitoring it. I just inputted everything at the end of the year and then realized that I'd done a really good job representing genders equally among my authors. Author nationality I didn't really fill in, so this chart isn't representative, but I did fill in continent and race. So you can see here that 71% of the authors I read were white authors and 28% were people of color. So I could work at balancing that out a bit for sure. And then author continent, I read 38% of the books that I read were from Europe, 46.2% of the books I read were from North America, 10% of the books that I read were from Africa, 2% from South America, and 4% from Asia. Again, I didn't really use the publishing house function, so I won't talk about that chart. The years published chart is what really surprised me at the end of the year because I didn't realize that I read that many books published in the 2010s. I would say that I mainly read like historical fiction and classics, but I guess most of the classics I read were all like spread out between from the 50s backwards, so it didn't amass quite as much as the 2010s books did. So I ended up reading 23 books in the 2010s, 8 books from the 2000s, 1 book from the 90s, and then 1 book from a lot of these generations. These would be a lot of my classics. 1930s I read 4 from, and the pre-1850s I read 4 from. The 1860s I read 2 from, and the 1910s I read 2 from, and the rest are all ones all along here. With regards to book format, I read just over half of my books in print format, about 30% of my books online, and another 15% were Kindle, and this for some reason isn't showing audiobooks, but I think I listened to maybe 2 or 3 of the books in audiobook format last year. This shows if I own them or not, so 78% of the books that I read I did not own, and only 21% I do own. So you can see I rely a lot on my library and on classics that are available free online for the majority of the books that I read. And then there's a section here for purchases, but I don't really buy books, again, as this chart shows, so I didn't really make use of that. Yeah, and then there is space to fill in, like if you're doing the Read Harder or Pop Sugar challenges. I kind of started keeping track of that, and I found it wasn't really working with my reading style, so I didn't make use of that. But that's the reading statistics. Again, I want to thank Portal in the Pages for creating this wonderful spreadsheet template and making it available for everyone to use. Highly recommend you check out her channel if you're interested in finding your own bookish stats, because I know she has a 2018 spreadsheet ready to download. Anyway, I think that's all I have for my 2017 wrap-up and stats video. I should be back soon with my 24 and 48 readathon vlog and a couple other 2017, 2018 kind of wrap-up intro videos. And so until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book.